All right. So this is an intro to pitching, which has been part of a series of things we've been doing. We did a intro to venture capital. That was just an entry point into understanding the VC world and venture funding. That's available on YouTube. You can go find it. This is the next installment, intro to pitching. We're going to be covering two things tonight, two main categories. The first is how do you build an effective pitch deck? And then second, how do you pitch in a way that's going to engage investors? Both are equally important. As a quick background, I went to school at the University of Minnesota. I left there to go work in a corporate role, marketing and operations. I left there to run operations for a venture-backed startup called Bright Sellers, which was my first exposure to pitching, my first exposure to venture capital. I left there to go run operations for another consumer packaged goods company. It was a parent company of two men's footwear brands. One was Moral Code, the other was Milwaukee Boot Company. Currently, I'm the co-founder of Uncrowd.io, and I'm also the founder of Fresh Coast Labs. With Uncrowd.io, we're working to connect underrepresented startup founders with investors. And with Fresh Coast Labs, I work directly with clients to help them with fundraising, everything from a lot of pitch practice, a lot of pitch deck work, but all the way into connections as well. So we're going to start by talking about building your pitch deck. And there's really only two things that are super important here. The first is to make it short and sweet. This is what you want. You don't want to go long. We'll get into why that is. And the other thing is to focus on visuals. I will tell you, I was very intentional with this deck itself in terms of how I laid out visuals and why I did. So let the deck that I'm talking to tonight be kind of representative of the type of deck, ideally, at least from a visual perspective, that I would recommend. I'm very careful to be clean, to be minimal, and to keep images kind of at the forefront. So starting with building your pitch deck, at a high level, you need to be thinking about time of your pitch, and you need to be thinking about length of the deck itself. Recognizing that, backward in time, recognizing that any of these are kind of what you're thinking of when you're getting ready to build your deck. You're going to be talking to investors, and you want to make sure that you have covered the things that are important without necessarily going overboard. So typically, we talk about pitching as an elevator pitch, and then a 4-minute is kind of the next level. So your elevator pitch is literally what it sounds like. It's you accidentally end up in an elevator with insert investor X, your dream investor, whether picture anyone on Shark Tank, you're accidentally riding in an elevator with Mark Cuban, and you know you've got 30 seconds to tell them about your product and win them over. That's your elevator pitch. The next pitch is kind of your 4 minutes. And this is when usually we're talking about an intro, a first time going through something. I will tell you that is not a hard and fast rule. This is not something where you need to be at 4 minutes, or it's going to be bad if you're not at 4 minutes. None of that is necessarily the case. These are generalizations for sure. The second thing is thinking about the length of your pitch deck. Typically, I recommend being at 10 slides or fewer, and oftentimes I recommend actually being fewer than that. But here, and we're going to go through each of what these slides are, but these are the slides that I think you should encourage you to include in your deck. First, something about your team, the problem, the solution you're solving, the product, the market opportunity, the competition in the space, the business model, how do you make money, the ask, and the exit strategy, and then just some kind of closing slide. And realistically, you can even scrap some of these. Team, truthfully, non-essential in a lot of cases, especially if your team isn't doing you any favors. Again, I'll get into all of this in more detail, but just trying to give you kind of a high-level overview before we dive in. Product, often integrated with solution. Competition, often integrated with market. Exit strategy and a close might not be necessary depending on the stage of your business. So let's work through what each of those individual slides are about. So first, team. Why are you the right person to lead this? Or why are you the right group of people to lead this? If you are in a space where there's a lot of experience from your team, it makes a ton of sense. I've been through this before. For example, when I was running a men's footwear company, well, that's given me important retail, footwear, leather experience. Theoretically, if I wanted to run a startup that was in that space, all of that experience would be super relevant, and I'd be highlighting that. Instead, I'm working in a startup right now that talks a lot about venture capital and venture funding. So I highlight a lot more of my experience with Bright Sellers, where I did a lot more of that work. It's important for us to recognize who the right people are and push from there. Problem. What is the issue or inefficiency you've identified? Now, we want to be succinct. We want to be clear on what our problem is. And but we also need to be, dumb it down sounds a little trivial, and I don't mean it to be that way, but we want to present it in a way that anyone can understand. A lot of times as startup founders, we are so engrossed in this that we really understand our product, understand our business at a truly comprehensive level. A lot of times investors don't, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But you need to educate them without necessarily going overboard. So really high level, what's your problem? Why is it a problem? Why does it matter? Equally quick, how do you solve that issue? So you've identified what's wrong, you've identified how to solve it. And then what you do is you connect the dots with your product. Your product is the linchpin between the problem and the solution. So now you've identified why you're the right person to do it. You've identified what the issue is. You've identified what the solution is, and you've identified why your product is the thing that's going to provide that solution. This is all kind of high-level intro. This is welcome to my product, welcome to my business, welcome to me. Now we start getting into the data side of things. The data is really important to investors. So the first thing we're talking about here is market. It doesn't really matter how big the problem is or how effective the solution is if the market itself is very small. You need to be able to talk about how large is this opportunity? Is this opportunity large enough where an investor can come in, invest in you, invest in your business, have you reach a point of scale, and then for them, make their money. When we talk about market, we're often talking about something called TAM, which is an acronym for total addressable market. Now, total addressable market is essentially if you were able to acquire 100% of the available market, if you were to monopolize the market, how much money would you make? How much money is available in that space? Now, this number is becoming really important. And I would say, truthfully, as I've talked to more investors, it's become more important. I don't know if necessarily COVID was the catalyst, but certainly as venture capital has become more competitive and de-risked, this is becoming a more important figure. I used to think of this figure as kind of an educated ballpark. Do your best math, figure it out, and move on. Now, I have recently encountered two different investors that I trust and respect. I consider them good investors who have told me that not a hard and fast rule, but honestly, they're strongly avoiding startups that don't have a TAM that's at least $10 billion. Now, I can tell you this is extreme. I know this is extreme, but it also lets you kind of understand how much an investor values TAM. They're going to look at that, and that to them tells the story of, for them, the reason they want that $10 billion TAM is because it means that there can be multiple winners in the space. They don't have to select the one person who's going to succeed. They can select a person who's going to succeed, and there's still room for others, and there's still room for everyone to make big money in the deal. Next, we get into talking about competition. So in addition to how large the market is, the next question becomes, how saturated is that market? Are you truly innovating something new? Are you the first to market? Or are you competing with someone with a similar technology? Or are you competing with a big boy? Are you competing with an Amazon? All of those become relevant. None of them are independently deal breakers, but it's really important to have a strong awareness of the competitive landscape so that you can articulate essentially for them how much risk there is here, how much competition is in the space. This is why we see a large value put on proprietary information now at this point. So intellectual property is huge. If you can get trademarked technology or patented technology, that's going to go a really long way in helping fundraise. That's a pretty unique niche, though. It's certainly not a deal breaker. But if you are in a tech space and you're able to get a patent, your life is going to be a lot easier raising funds. Next comes the model. And the model is essentially just how do you make money? You've already identified, all this good stuff about why this problem exists. Here's the solution. Here's why your product's going to be the thing that's phenomenal. You've talked about opportunity. Here's how much money we could make. I'm the only person here. Now the question is just like, how do you make money? What are you selling here? What does your sales process look like? And along with that, a lot of times we start talking about forecasting as well. What kind of projections are we making in terms of what that revenue is going to be? Now, again, a lot of times on the math side, including here in model, less in the sales side, but more in the projection side, investors understand that you are making smart, not uninformed, but it's guesses. It's a lot of guesswork. It's a lot of projecting of what you think is going to happen, but it's more so going through the practice of it, demonstrating that you've thought it through, demonstrating that you understand the numbers and you understand the financial side is why that's important. Then you get down to the ask, which frankly, a surprising number of founders, pitchers, forget to include, which is, what do you want from the person you're pitching? And you want to be clear. You want to be able to articulate this very, very cleanly. If you want $1 million, say you want $1 million. If you want introductions to other investors, if you want advice, those are all things you can pitch for. It's totally fine. If you want to pitch for a mentor, you can. But again, just be very clear out of fairness to the person that you're pitching to, that they understand what you're looking for. Usually on that ask will also include what they get in return. So you might say something like, I am pitching, we want to raise $1 million for 18 months of runway at a $5 million post-money valuation. That would be a common ask. That would be a common version of an ask. If what I just said sounds like a foreign language, I definitely recommend watching our first video on Intro to Venture Capital, because I really dive into that specific languaging on an ask. Then the last thing that not the last thing, but the last thing that's important is going to be the exit. And this is really what an investor is always looking for, is how do they make money? So an investor only makes money if there is an exit. And what that means is your startup ends up being acquired or really, really blows up and ends up having an IPO. And so that's the path that an investor is calculating. So even if everything else lines up, they like what you've said about the market, they like the problem, they think you have a real product that solves a real problem, that you're the first in the space, everything's good there. If there is not a pathway to an exit, that's going to be a problem. It's going to be difficult for investors to see how they make their money back. That's why we talk about comps a lot, which are comparables. And this is essentially taking a look at some other company that is either in industry and similar to you, or out of industry, but a similar type of business or a similar type of story that has previously been acquired, because it demonstrates an opportunity. It demonstrates a reality here. I think a lot of times founders get nervous or get scared when they see somebody that they would consider a competitor, even loosely, get acquired. And sure, there are reasons to be nervous about that. That means that all of a sudden they have more resources and they have opportunity to do things that you don't yet. But I honestly think it's more good than it is bad, because now all of a sudden someone else has demonstrated a pathway to success that you can point to, and you can say, hey, my company is similar to them. We do something different, but we're similar. We're serving the same type of customer, and Google just acquired them for $2 billion. So I have a pathway to $2 billion now, and you need to jump on board now. That's a really compelling pitch. And then lastly is just to close. And a lot of times this is just a end slide. It's a Q&A, it's a thank you, and it puts your follow-up contact information. Just something that as these decks get shared, investors can quickly find who they're looking for. As we talk about building your pitch deck, I want to come back to focusing on the visuals. So the first thing you want to see is you want visuals that complement what you're saying. So when I'm talking right now, what I don't want is everyone who's listening to me talk have to be reading a paragraph or be looking at something and trying to comprehend something that's difficult to comprehend. And I also don't want my deck to say the exact same thing that I'm saying. It gives me the deck gives me an opportunity to present something that's in favor of what I want to talk about. So I use my images to support what I'm saying. I use my images to complement my message. So here I have a clean slide that is telling you a few things that I'm going to talk about in a way that is not necessarily clouding my message. So I'm going to be talking about using images to complement what you're saying, which I'm talking about right now. I'm going to be talking about using images to accentuate, and then I'm going to talk about using images to help visualize data, which is a really important piece, and we'll get to in a second. And I'll also demonstrate how color can pop. So data is something that is very difficult to explain. This is why charts and graphs exist. And I have been in so many pitches where somebody has spent way too much time talking about a piece of data or talking about calculating data when it would have been so easy for them to just throw a chart or a graph up on the screen. Charts and graphs are your friends because everything you're doing is trying to be quick. You're trying to be succinct. You're trying to speed up. And what you want is to make it very easy for your investor or whomever you're pitching to synthesize that data in a hurry and understand exactly the point you're getting to. Calculating data, trying to keep track of different data points in your head is difficult. Use your screen, use the deck to your advantage. The other thing you can do is you can accentuate things. This is really important. So here I am with essentially the same slide that I was just talking about, but now it's really clear exactly what point I'm highlighting. I've changed the background. I've made the $130 billion I'm talking about bigger and brighter. And the reason I'm doing this is because even if I'm building to something, if I'm talking about all the important industry knowledge that I have and how I got here, what I really want is I want that investor to remember $130 billion. I want that investor after I'm the, who knows, 200th pitch he or she has seen in that week. I want them to go, what was that one that had 130 billion? That was what company was that? I want to talk to those guys again. I just want something to stick. And so if I'm talking about something important that I want the investor to stick around, I really try to accentuate that visually within the slide deck. Now, I want to show you the alternative. So this is the same information I just provided you, but this is in really long paragraph form. And this is exactly what I see from a lot of novice pitchers, is they just put all the information they plan to say into written word. And it's clean. I don't think it's crowded. I don't think it's visually unpleasing, but you can see that this is annoying for you to have to listen to me at the same time that you're trying to read. And the reality is you're probably only paying half attention to one side of this. And that's not what I want from a pitcher. I want you to pay attention to exactly what I want you to pay attention to when I want you to pay attention to it. The last thing I want is for me to be making my grand point, but instead you're still reading point 3, which says graphs and charts can easily synthesize data. I don't want you to lose track of what I'm trying to share with you. And so that's why visuals become so vital. Then, after we've built our deck and we have all of these important content pieces that we've covered, all the necessary information, and we've built that out visually beautiful, then we start talking about how do we engage investors. And I will tell you, engaging the investors, there is a lot less public information on this. There is all kinds of public information on building a pitch deck. Frankly, there are people who are better at it than me. I won't even pretend to be the best pitch deck builder. If you really want to find a good pitch deck, and I mean this sincerely, you should Google Airbnb's pitch deck. I think most founders are shocked at what it looks like. It is so simple. It is so straightforward, and it's amazing that they were able to raise the money. But then when you actually think about it and you look at it and you go, this is great. I understand exactly what Airbnb was doing. I know what their product is. I know where they stand. And if I was an investor, this would make sense to me. Use Airbnb's pitch deck as a model for yours. I think I refer back to Airbnb's pitch deck regularly. So then when we get to more nuance is when we talk about actually engaging investors. And this becomes a lot less content-based. It becomes a lot less data-based to a point. I'll get to that. But there's a lot more nuance to it. And this is where, frankly, it's often performative. So there's 3 things that you should be thinking of in terms of engaging your investors. The first is doing your research. The second is knowing your stuff. And the third is being human. So when it comes to engaging investors, you need to do your research. The single biggest frustration I hear from investors is being overwhelmed with cold outreach, and particularly cold outreach from founders that don't really know what they're doing or why they reached out in the first place. And this is not founders' faults. I want to be clear about this. The venture capital ecosystem is a bizarre one. It's confusing in a lot of places. But what you need to know is if you are reaching out to an investor, if you're reaching out cold to an investor, you are among a lot of people who are reaching out cold to an investor. Not a reason not to do it, but just understand that there is a very high bar for getting pulled out of that group. And so one of the things that you want to make sure when you're heading into this pitch, if you've actually gotten to the point where an investor has said, I want to hear about this, I want to learn more about this, well, make sure that they're the type of investor that literally can invest in you. So the first thing is, do they invest in the stage that you're investing in? A lot of investors, almost every investment in a venture capital fund, almost most investors at angel levels will be clear about this too, but usually this is public information. Usually it's just on their website. They talk about the stage they invest in. They talk about thesis as well. So thesis would be more of like industry or some other part of their thesis. A lot of times it is a certain field. So like, we invest in fintech, financial technology. Sometimes there's geographic components, like we invest in fintech in Indiana. Sometimes there's social impact components, but almost always like the thesis is big and bold on their website, simply because that's how they raised their money. They went to their partners, their LPs, their limited partners, and said, this is our thesis. This is where we think we can make money. Give us money to do this. And then they follow through and do it. So make sure your company aligns with thesis. It doesn't do either of you any good. Yeah, if you go in there and you are we'll say a med tech company, you have a great medical technology, but you're pitching some company that only invests in fintech, financial technology, well, that's no good for anybody. It doesn't really matter how good your product is. It doesn't matter how good your pitch is. You're just misaligned. Similar with stage. That's this other thing. A lot of funds, and this is, as an aside, a problem in venture capital. Venture capital has a very hard time going early right now. And so a lot of times you'll be very excited as a founder that you found a fund that totally aligns. They love what you're about. They everything matches, everything's perfect, but they just don't invest that early. You're looking for your seed money. You're looking for your pre-seed money, and they're writing Series A checks, or they're writing just even seed checks that are just larger than what you actually need or what you're looking for. Those things, those misalignments, are a frustration for investors. Investors expect that if you're pitching, that you've done some of this homework and that you understand where alignment is. So next, is the investor aware you're pitching? This is a big one. A lot of this comes to something we'll talk about in a second, but a lot of founders feel like they almost need to be coy about the fact that they're pitching. Like they'll reach out and be like, hey, how's it going? Like, I'm Forrest, I'm working with this company Uncrowd, and I'd love to talk to you about what we have going on. I'd love to talk to you about how we might be able to help you. That's great. That's a fine way to get an intro. But if I'm that vague and that investor says, yeah, I'll have a conversation with you, that investor is not prepared for me to pitch to them. That is an unfair thing to do. If that investor thinks we're going to have a collaborative conversation and I'm going to talk about how I might be able to help them, or maybe even do a sales call, like think I'm going to try to sell them something, that's very different than me flipping the script and telling them like, I want to pitch you. And oftentimes there's an entire deal flow process that you might be subverting. Again, this is an annoyance for investors, and I understand why. They have ways they like to do things, and you just need to be clear about that. If you want to pitch an investor, let them know you want to pitch. Tell them you want to pitch. If you want advice, tell them you want advice. All of those things are okay. Just be clear about what you're looking for. And then the last thing on the research side is looking for any public thoughts on pitching or investing from that specific investor or from that fund. Content production is very common in venture capital. There are a lot of thought leaders. There are people who do interesting things, and frankly, people do want their perspective. They want to know, how did you get here? Why do you invest the way you do? Where do you invest? All those kinds of things are interesting information. Most investors have something that's semi-public about what they look for and why they look for it. All of this is to say, these are things that can help inform your process. This is less something that's going to annoy an investor, but it is something that can give you a leg up. So I will give you two examples of things I saw recently. There is a prominent corporate investor that is near me, and literally on their page, they have a blog post by the fund manager, the primary general partner, who just wrote about like, how do you pitch them? And in there's one little tidbit, like one little nugget. It's not a very long blog, but in there's one little nugget that this specific investor thinks Team Slide should go last. This investor doesn't want to be swayed by who's on the team. He doesn't care about past experience. He wants to be bought into the idea based on all the information, and then team can be secondary. Well, you can guess, like when I went and pitched this guy, I sure as heck moved my team slide to the end. At minimum, just a signal that I was paying attention and doing my research. I don't know if it mattered or not, but it at least aligned with how this investor thinks. Now, on the flip side, we recently were talking to another fund who really clearly spelled out like what different things they're looking for with check marks. And the thing that had 3 check marks was team. Team was the thing they cared about the most. So we put team very prominent, and we spent more time talking about team when we were going through our pitch. The way you build your deck and the way that you pitch is not set in stone. You do not need to do the same thing every single time. If anything, I would recommend not doing that. I would recommend tailoring your pitch, tailoring your deck to the person you're pitching to the group that you're pitching. And similar, really quick on that note, is it is totally okay to have 2 decks, one that you pitch and one that you share. A lot of times, investors will ask you to send the deck to them ahead of time, and a lot of times investors will pass a deck around. Well, all the advice I just gave you about visuals becomes incomplete when you're not there to talk over it and you're not there to explain. So feel free to have another deck that is great for passing around, that's a little more comprehensive and has a little more, might be a little wordier and might be include more explanation in it. But pitch from that one. Pitch from the one where your voice does the explaining. Next thing to engage investors is knowing your stuff. So this comes into practice. Practice pitching. Pitch anyone. Pitch everyone, actually. Pitch your mom, pitch your dad, pitch your grandma, pitch your kids. Get really used to pitching. And also get used to doing Q&A. The questions that your mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and friends and uncles are going to have are a lot of times going to align with the same questions an investor will have. If you weren't clear to them, you can't guarantee that you're going to be clear to an investor either. An investor does not necessarily have background in your space. So your pitch should be good enough that it makes sense to everybody. And it should be clean enough that you can do it kind of from the top of your head without necessarily needing to read the slides, without necessarily needing to know exactly where you are in the presentation, which is helpful when you start mixing it up too, when you start customizing it depending on the investor. You're going to want to make sure that you know your stuff. Be succinct. The next slide gets a little more into this, but essentially just recognize that your business is everything to you, and it should be. That's really important. But to an investor, especially in conversation 1, you are just another person that wants money from them. So you really need to be respectful of their time. You need to recognize that you might be the 40th pitch they've seen that day, depending on what's happening that day. And so you being succinct, getting through things quickly, not spending time, letting time drag on, not diving too deep into the deep details is in your favor. You want to move quick. You want to keep it exciting. Understand the money. I cannot stress this one enough. A lot of times, those kind of operational slides, those slides that I talked about at the end, your TAM, your total addressable market, your revenue production, your financial projections, those kind of things become an afterthought for a lot of founders, frankly. I think it takes, this is painting with a broad brush, but I think founders inherently are less risk averse, so we're comfortable doing stuff. And a lot of times that leads to some creativity, and the parts of a founder brain doesn't necessarily always align with the data and the how are we going to make money and how are we going to do that effectively, how are we going to scale. Those are really important pieces for investors. And it's not enough to just have them in your slide deck. You need to be able to have them in your slide deck, even if you had an accountant calculate them for you, if you had somebody else do the math for you, if you had somebody else put the data together and make it look beautiful, that's fine. But you really need to understand it forwards and backwards so that you can speak to it, because you are going to get questions about it, and they're going to be detailed questions about it, because that's what an investor is looking for. An investor is looking to make money, and so you need to be able to have that conversation with them. And then last, understand the role of an investor. And I know this might seem obvious, but most investors are not actually that interested in just giving you money and letting you run. Some of them do. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but a lot of times an investor, and this sort of comes back to the research side, want different things from their investments. Some want a board seat. Some are super helpful. Some are less helpful. These are all things that you should know when you're talking to investors and thinking about your relationship with them and their relationship with you. When you're talking to an investor, their role is to make money. Their role is to figure out a pathway for your business to not just grow, but grow and exit. And so if you can help make that process make sense to an investor, you're doing yourself a big favor. And if you can talk about that in a way that aligns with how that investor likes to do those things, not just the pathway, but also if you understand how this specific investor likes to engage with their companies. And again, this is easy to do. It is not something that not a lot of founders do. Frankly, it's because it's just work and it's bandwidth, and you're going to get a million no's. But investor portfolios are public information. You can look up who they've invested in. You can go talk to other founders and say like, hey, what are these like? What are they like as an investor? Are they good investors? Are they bad investors? And I say bad investor. I think bad investor is often a little is overstated, but there are investors that will make your life more difficult. That is because they like to be more controlling investors. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but especially if you need some more controls around you. But those are important things for you to know and important things for you to speak to, honestly. If you can speak to, if you know you're pitching an investor who likes to take more control of the companies that they're investing in, you can open yourself up for that and say, I need some control. I need someone to help guide me here. That's really helpful. If you can align with what the investor's after, that's going to get you very far. All right, to me, this is the most important slide. This is the thing that I think if there is anything in this presentation you won't find just from Googling about pitch decks, this is the thing that it is. And it's really about being a human when you are pitching. The first thing is be yourself. I know that pitching can be scary. I know pitch competitions can be scary, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But you really need to be yourself. And there's a number of reasons why. The first one, passion and excitement are good for you. Remember, you are not just competing with having your business align in the investor's eyes. You're competing with having your business align and make sense. And you're competing with anyone else who's pitching that investor to also be the most effective of the pitches that came. Being passionate and excited about the work you're doing is super important. I hope you're not a founder unless you're passionate and excited about it. But what I see from a lot of founders is going to pitch. It's probably a little easier during COVID because you get to be in your own space and do things your own way. But I can tell you, for a lot of founders, going to a boardroom and maybe dressing up is way outside the scope of what a normal day is like. And that creates a tension. It creates a sense of an other, like I don't belong here. And all of a sudden things tighten up and founders start giving a school presentation, I would say, where everything becomes very dry and just pointing out, reading, talking about there, very monotonous. That is not in your favor. Investors want someone who cares. Like, and I mean that not just in like an excited and like they want to work with someone who cares. They do, but like it's good for their investment if you eat, sleep, and breathe this. It's good for their investment if you love your product so much that you just like reading industry newsletters and you think that this minute thing about your industry is interesting. That's good for an investor. They want someone that cares at that level. And unfortunately, a lot of founders end up hiding that part because they feel like that passion and that excitement is going to be unprofessional, I'll say. And certainly there's a fine line there, but more often than not, I think founders miss the mark here. Next, honesty and transparency is good. You are, for literally, like an investor becomes a partner. They're a financial partner. I strongly believe in honesty and transparency from any founder. Anything on the data side, it's going to get figured out when they do their diligence. If you get to that point, they're not going to invest without double checking your financials, without making sure all of the information you claimed is true. But I also think it's really important that you as a person are honest and transparent about what your goals are and how you operate. The last thing you want is to present yourself as something you're not and then get funded based on that, because then you're going to have to be that thing that you aren't actually for the future. You're going to have to keep being that person because your investors aren't going anywhere. Now, on the flip side, If you can find investors that not just are interested in your business, but also totally align with you and how you operate, now all of a sudden you get to be yourself and you have partners that significantly align in your way of thinking, and they become such value adds, such allies for your business, and such an important part of your growth. And then your lived experience is valuable. I think because so much of pitching is focusing on kind of the large opportunity, the big picture, here's what we could be, that a lot of times founders are less comfortable talking about their own experience within the space. This is a mistake. You should absolutely be talking about why your product, why the solution aligns for you specifically. It's one of the things that I think, frankly, investors miss the mark on a lot of times, is investors don't necessarily put enough trust in a founder that knows the space, that has lived that space. And I know for a fact, I've talked to investors that go the other way and are so enamored with founders who are solving problems that are specific to them, that they go, this is phenomenal. This person, this individual has a decade of market experience just because they were annoyed with this thing, or this thing was difficult for them. And it's something that I would never understand, but now I do because they've been there. Your lived experience is incredibly valuable. Do not ignore that lived experience. Do not assume that that is too anecdotal. It's really important. Which gets into then the investor side of this, recognizing that investors are human. So very closely aligned with lived experience is just making your pitch interesting. What's the story? What's the narrative? What's the idea behind why is your pitch special from any other pitch that's just going to run through a bunch of numbers? It's that narrative. I was working with a founder this week, actually, who was talking about two different individuals, like how their product brings two different types of individuals together, combines their resources, helps them build something bigger, and then puts it back out into the world. And essentially that's how she talked about it. And I said, well, have you done this before? And she was like, yeah, we were already doing this. And I was like, okay, I want to hear that story. Like, I want to hear about Mike from this world and Dave from this world that you brought together, used their powers to create something bigger, and then tell me what happened to them after it got back out there with this new product that was out there. Like, that story it's way more compelling to have that human element in there than to talk about it in the hypothetical. And so make your pitch interesting. Tell your story, weave that story throughout, keep it interesting. Second, don't put investors on a pedestal. This is really, really hard to do, especially for founders who are pitching or raising money for the first time. And I want to acknowledge the inherent power dynamic. You're literally going there to ask them for money. I understand that there is a huge power dynamic there, but you will be better served by not treating them as something better than you. And I mean that, like, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I mean, like, you are equal to them. You are a human who deserves to be treated as an equal to an investor. And if an investor doesn't see that, that's a problem. And that's not someone you want investing in you, because you don't want to have to deal with that forever anyway. But also, you can have a real conversation then. Like, that is an important piece to this. Like, in the same way that, like, you don't want an investor to treat you that way, and guess what? Investors don't want to well, I won't say this, not all investors. A lot of the investors that I like and I respect want you to consider themselves peers. Like, they want to have peer-to-peer conversations. They want to have those types of conversations. And so getting into a pitch where you can just talk to a person and talk to them in a way that's as if they're equal, and as if your idea is valid and has merit and is just as important as their role, and their role is funding good ideas, and you happen to have a great idea, so they're lucky to talk to you because you have the idea that's going to make them rich. Guess what? That's a better pitch. It's a better pitch than groveling. It's a better pitch than begging for money, and it will help you. And then the last thing is, in a similar note, what's in it for them? Fundamentally, this is sales. When you're selling, you need to convince the other person that this makes sense for them. And so everything in a vacuum kind of goes away when you can, like, when you're just talking about kind of high level market information, high level product information. Ground this for them. Bring this down to a level that they understand, and talk about, like, this is good for you specifically because I am going to make so much money. and I am going to do this, and you are going to look great. You are going to be the person that was the first investor in on this company that's now going to be a unicorn, and you're going to get to ride that for the rest of your life. Now, I would not necessarily articulate it in that way, but creating a value proposition that makes makes the engagement make sense to them is important. It shouldn't be just one-sided. Like, they should get something out of this, and you should be able to help them see that in a way beyond the numbers. You should help them see that in a way that's exciting for them as humans. Recognize that they have ego attached to this too. They want all of their investments to succeed. That's how they get their money. But not just their money, that's how they get their notoriety. I was literally talking to an investor today that was talking about an investor out in San Francisco, a different investor that is raising a shocking amount of money for a new fund based on being one of the very, very early investors in Uber. Now, that part is verifiable. They were an early investor in Uber. The amount they invested, unclear. We don't really know. They could have been $10,000 to go build the app. But now that person, simply by being tied to Uber and saying like, hey, I knew something that you didn't know, a lot of people are giving that person a lot of money to go ahead and raise a big fund. That's what's in it for them. And you need to help them understand that. Pitching, it's really not that complicated. It feels really scary. Keep it short and sweet. Focus on your visuals when you're building your deck. When it comes to engaging investors, do your research. Don't come in blind. Know your stuff. You should know your product particularly, but your financials are really vital that you know them. And just be a human. Be a normal person. Talk to them like normal people, and recognize that you don't want a partner that doesn't align with you on a human level. So we built Uncrowd. This is the product we built. We connect founders with investors. So if you are at the point where you are looking to start raising funds, we'd love to have you join uncrowd.io. That's literally what we do. I certainly want to talk briefly about the pitch competition that's coming up. We are partnering. This presentation I'm giving right now is in partnership with the Milky Way Tech Hub and the AmFam Institute and the P5 project. They are doing a $15,000 pitch competition. That is, the deadline for that is October 30th. So if you haven't already, make sure you go to the p5project.com/pitch and sign up for that. And if you are pitching at that event, like, keep in mind what I said here. Pitch competitions are scary. A lot of people are watching. I have heard some rumors of who might be judging that event, and they are big names, big, cool names of people you want to impress. If the rumors I've heard are true, but don't let that get to you. Like, they're human beings. Be normal. Be yourself. We also have another event that we're hosting coming up as part of leading up to that pitch event. We're going to be doing a fireside chat with Garnett Harriman. He's the managing partner at Fuel.atl. He's a senior advisor at Impact ROI. He's the director at Columbia Venture Community. I promise you, he has a whole bunch of other hats. He is an amazing impact investor. He's somebody I look up to immensely. I'm super psyched to have this conversation. That will be next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. So same time we started, just Wednesday instead of Tuesday. If you want to sign up for that, Adam, if you can put that link in the chat, but it's bit.ly/uncrowdfireside. And really, we're going to talk, this is going to be a direct conversation with an investor. I'm going to be asking questions that I, as a founder, want to know from an investor. And this is not a small investor. This is a big investor. This is a California investor we're talking a lot of money. I also want to highlight some of the other workshops that are coming up. We are so pleased to be a part of this. I'm really impressed with what the Milky Way is doing for this to get this going. But so we have our event with Garnett coming up on the 28th. The next day after that, MKE Black is doing Behind the Tech of MKE Black. We have then on the 30th, MB CoLab is doing their strategic testing. So reducing risk through testing and learning. If you are building a product, you are going to want to attend that. And then on that's on the 12th. I jumped ahead. It's the 30th is Perceptform, which is the intro to cryptocurrency with Perceptform. I'm assuming that's going to be Christopher Perceptions talking about that. That dude is awesome. He knows crypto in a really cool way. And it's a really cool segue as a founder. he wrote an amazing piece of content for us. So we started a content hub specifically for founder information. So stuff like this is going to be hosted there, but we also have founder stories in there. So specifically, Christopher wrote The Black Formula, The Journey of a Black Founder. It is super intense, super emotional. It really does a great job just highlighting how difficult it is to be a Black founder. And I think he's awesome, somebody you will want to know, somebody you want to pay attention to. I am always soliciting more stories. So if you are a founder and you want to share your journey, we'd love to have you contribute to adam@uncrowd.io. I think that takes care of all the housekeeping. So I am going to now turn it over to questions. And I encourage you to ask me questions. I want to make sure everyone gets out of this what they were hoping to.
All right, Forrest, we have a couple questions coming through the chat.
Yeah.
And you touched base on a couple of them, but one, Anthony from Cardano wants to get your thoughts on the send ahead decks.
Yeah. I think you need to do them. Like, I guess that's the first thing is like the sending decks is almost like we talk about kind of an economy of warm intros within getting to be able to connect with investors. Well, the economy between investors is the sending of decks. Investors send decks to each other. This is a sign of like trust and faith. Like, hey, I'm looking at this. I thought you might be interested in this. So you want those decks out there. You want people looking at them. As far as I said, I often will have a slightly tweaked deck that I send ahead that's just provides a little bit more information, maybe a little bit more detail than what I want to be talking over. But I would encourage you to do it. I would encourage, and I know, I mean, if you want, I can ask some more detailed question on that in the chat about specifics. I'm happy to answer it. But I know that some founders worry about their deck getting out, and they're worried about like it getting public or worried about a competitor seeing it. Depending on your stage, I would not worry about that too much. I'm going to be cautious with that because I don't want to have you do something dumb. But like, unless you're doing something truly, truly innovative or something that's going to be cutting edge that you're afraid they're going to beat you to market with, I wouldn't be too shy about sharing your deck. I usually think it's better to get it in front of more eyeballs than it is to be kind of protective over it. But if there's something truly confidential, don't do it in a send ahead deck. Save it for when you're pitching in person.
Thanks, Forrest. And then just to tweak on that question from Douglas is, instead of tweaking the deck, should maybe the deck that you have include speaker notes to add more detail, or would you recommend providing a completely different deck with the detail included on the slides?
I don't include speaker notes when I'm sending stuff. I usually only send PDFs of any of my decks, and that is my own fear of having somebody edit something and without my control over it. So I never include speaker notes when I'm sending decks ahead. I would rather actually tweak the deck itself to hit the key points than to just overwhelm with mountains of data. I mean, the other thing is, being succinct is still an important part of this. The reality is, like, whether you're pitching them or whether they're reading the deck independently, I guarantee you it is in a stack of 100 other decks or an email inbox of 100 other decks that they're probably not going to get through.
All right. Are there any suggestions on tools for creating decks or any templates that you recommend?
Yeah. So I think, as I said, I recommend checking out Airbnb's deck because you'll be like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that this is the deck that raised this much money. SlideShare has a bunch of famous decks or famous companies' decks that you can take a look at. There's a new company, I feel like I'm going to space on their name, but I think they're out of Madison, called AirDeck, which is kind of changing the model a little bit on send ahead and things like that. They're doing some interesting stuff. And I do have some other tools. I don't have them off top of my head, but I will make sure I include them. We'll end up posting this on YouTube, and I'll make sure I include those tools when we post this.
Excellent. And then what's your opinion on adding additional details in an appendix of a pitch deck?
Oh, great question. Actually, I would say that is an incomplete part of mine, frankly. I should have included this in there. I think I love having stuff in an appendix. I encourage stuff in an appendix, especially when you're pitching. I don't usually include stuff in an appendix when I'm doing send ahead stuff, but I don't think it hurts anything. But really, after some time pitching and after you've had enough conversations, there's probably going to be 7 to 10 kind of key questions that come up regularly. And all investors, and they're all kind of, not every investor is going to care about all of them. So it doesn't totally, and some of them are maybe questions you don't totally want to answer either, or certainly don't want to bring up, but you want to be prepared to answer them well in case they do come up. So I always use that as kind of an appendix. I have a slide that's ready to go, but it's not part of my pitch. So if I know there's something that is questionable about my market, or questionable about the industry, or questionable about the product, that I think is going to come up, I want to make sure that I have something clean and thought out that will address it, but I don't necessarily want to present it. So if the investor says like, hey, Forrest, I've heard two-sided marketplaces have a really hard time getting off the ground, I can jump to my two-sided marketplace slide and go like, yeah, you're totally right. Like, acquiring users early on is really difficult. The value proposition is hard, but here's how things go when they get further. It's not necessarily something I always want to talk about, but I'm happy to address it when an investor needs to hear it.
Thanks, Forrest. Is there any other question? Oh, there's one more question that just came in. Do you have any suggestions specific to a nonprofit pursuing a funding pitch?
Yeah. So I think philanthropy is really not far off from venture capital. At the end of the day, similar types of people being pitched: corporations, high net worth individuals. I do think impact automatically becomes a little more important and a little more elevated than kind of the ROI. Fundamentally, if anyone's donating to a nonprofit, they want that money to go to good work. They want that money to go to, and so being able to articulate that impact is what I would consider kind of the market. So when you're talking about your total addressable market, think of that as the total addressable impact and where those dollars are going to go. Specifically, there's often a question of how much of these dollars are going toward operations and how much are going directly to kind of mission. I would say my experience is that, frankly, the philanthropists or the contributors, the donors, they don't want to see a bunch go to operations. Let's call it what it is. But also, your nonprofit can't exist without money for operations. And so I think being able to tell that story, A, what percentage of this is actually going to go toward impact, but B, I think the bigger piece that is important to talk about is, why is that? Like, what are the operation side of that? Because, and being able to say like, hey, this is vital. Like, this is an important thing. Like, we can't do our mission without being able to do these operations. I think that's really important. And then the only other thing I would add for nonprofits specifically is talking about economic incentives. Have a good understanding of the tax side of like, what does a donation do for you? And is there anything special within your state or your city or your economic development program that is going to like amplify whatever that donation is? Those are all really important things to be able to address.
All right. And the last question we have is, do you have any suggestions on pitching at competitions in front of multiple investors?
Yeah, I do. I think it's hard. I think lean into being yourself and being big and being energized even more. In a pitch competition, somebody is going to get the money. You're not pitching in isolation, right? Like, it's either going to be you or one of the other people you met backstage. So that helps your odds in a big way, but you need something that's going to stand out. So really, like, I think of like from an energy perspective, like, you have to control the room. Like, you have to have all eyes on you, and you have to do something. Like, when we talked about kind of accentuating certain things, like, really lean into that. Like, if you have, the best version of this I've ever seen was a generator premiere night, and there was a company called Pretty Litter it was their premiere night, and the founder had this absolute like hockey stick graph, like, boom, like, we started slow, and then like literally like the 2 or 3 months before premiere night, it was like boom, and this graph was just up there, and it was like a rock star moment. Like, everyone was like, oh my God, and he just like let it breathe. Like, he let everyone just sit there in that moment. I don't remember, and I shouldn't say that. Nothing else from that evening stands out to me aside from that single moment of like everyone reacting to this one big specific piece of information.
All right. Looks like we're coming up at the top of the hour, and I don't see any other questions. So I just want to thank everybody for joining tonight. Thank you, Forrest, for sharing all this information on pitching. You can be able to check us out on YouTube. We'll post it there. We'll also post it at webflow.io, like Forrest said. So thanks again.
Have a good night, everybody.